In this video, we are going to discuss the development of English colonial society throughout period 2 between the years of 1607 and the founding of Jamestown to 1754 and the French and Indian War. This video will address developments in social structures, religious practices, government policies, labor systems, economic practices, and cultural activities. Big questions to ask yourself as you watch this video. How and why did the colonies develop a unique and independent society separate from that of England? What role did religion and the Enlightenment play in the development of the English colonies? Why did slavery develop in the British colonies, and how did Africans resist this? And in what ways did the colonies embrace their Anglican connections, and how did England try to force its influence on the colonies? It is important to remember that there were regional differences between the colonies, and these differences impacted who came to that specific colony and why particular groups settled there in the first place. Often, geography played a significant role in shaping each colony. For example, as you can see from the maps on this slide, there was a variance in soil type and length of growing season along the eastern coast. These differences influenced what type of cash crop could be grown in each region. In the deep south, you had sugar and indigo harvested on plantations. Tobacco was grown in the Chesapeake region. You had wheat and corn grown in the middle colonies and in America's breadbasket. But in the north, where there was a very short growing season and poor soil, little commercial farming took place, and instead they were forced to fish, build ships, and participate in trade and manufacturing. From the beginning of period 2, there was a massive population boom in the colonies. This growth happened for three reasons. Reason number one, colonists had a long lifespan and lived healthier lives than people who initially lived in Europe. These longer lifespans and having healthier mothers led to an increased birth rate. The second reason, due to religious, political, and economic turmoil, many Europeans from all over England were fleeing to the Americas for refuge. The largest group of migrants were still English, but there was also a significant portion of Germans, Scots, Irish, Scotch-Irish, Dutch, and Swedish immigrants settling mostly in the more tolerant middle colonies and along the backcountry frontier seen along the Appalachian Mountains. The final reason for population increase was the African diaspora and the increased practice of the Atlantic slave trade. Africans were captured and transported across the Atlantic Ocean over the Middle Passage and sold in the Americas to work mostly as slaves on southern plantations. Those three reasons led to the dramatic increase in population in the Americas. There were major societal differences between the New England colonies and the southern plantation colonies. Let's first look at the New England colonies. These colonies were created for largely Puritan religious motives. Initially, the Pilgrims or Separatists arrived and created the Plymouth colony, and they were then followed by the Puritans who created the Massachusetts Bay colony. They arrived for the freedom to practice their religious beliefs, but that does not mean they were tolerant or understanding of other religions. They developed close-knit, homogeneous settlements that were centered around towns and a town hall in each town. The life expectancy is longer and more stable for people living in the New England colonies than those living in the Chesapeake colonies. The New England colonies were influenced by their religious beliefs, the role of family, and the importance of education. In fact, every town required the creation of a school and church as well as a town hall. And in that town hall, land-owning male church members met to discuss political policies. Many immigrants came to the New England colonies, but most of them were Protestant. They had a mixed economy due mostly to the geography, and therefore there's very few plantation economics and more fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and manufacturing. The most important city in the New England colonies was Boston. Now let's look at some aspects of the southern plantation colonies and compare them to the New England colonies. The South had a higher percentage of the population that was male, meaning more people living in the southern colonies were men, and men had almost all the power and influence in the southern colonies as well. In the southern colonies, people lived a harsher life and existence because of the lack of females, so there's very little birth rate increases happening, and also because of high disease, lots of malaria. This made life harsher and harder for people living in the southern and Chesapeake colonies. Whereas New England colonies were made up of tight-knit towns, the southern colonies had a defined hierarchy of wealth and status, with the wealthy landowning gentry dominating life in the South. Their power came from their control over the cash crop plantation economy. Tobacco was grown in the Chesapeake and North Carolina colonies. Rice and indigo was grown in the Deep South colonies. Because they lived on plantations, instead of having many tightly packed towns, there was a spread out field to the southern colonies with very few towns and more large farms. To work on these cash crop plantations, labor systems were used. Slavery was practiced throughout all of the colonies, but it was more highly concentrated in the South. Initially, indentured servants, who were brought over to the colonies by the headright system, worked alongside slaves on the plantations. But after Bacon's Rebellion, indentured servants became a less popular labor system, and the use of slavery began to grow more. Listed below are different reasons for why the growth and the continued use of slavery took place in the South and throughout the other parts of the colonies. You should know these reasons for why the transition from indentured servants to slaves took place. Speaking of this transition, Bacon's Rebellion is one of the major turning points for the increase in slavery in the colonies and in particular in the South. The headright system was used by England to grant immigrants and landowners more land to settle the American colonies. Over time, the number of indentured servants continued to grow, but all the land was being controlled by a small number of landowners. Tensions over land ownership and Native American conflict led to rebellion between poor Virginian farmers and wealthy Virginia planters. The rebellion was led by Nathaniel Bacon, who chased Governor William Berkeley temporarily out of Virginia until royal militias were able to restore order. After the rebellion, the use of indentured servants became less desirable, and access to African slaves and the usage of African slaves became the preferred form of economic labor. African slaves arrived in the Americas as part of the Atlantic system or the Atlantic triangular trade. There were three legs to this trade system. First, finished goods, liquor, and weapons were exchanged with African kings for captured Africans from neighboring tribes. These captured Africans were exchanged for raw goods and materials in the Americas. Finally, the raw materials and goods were then exchanged with Europe for finished products, and the whole process would repeat itself again. The most notorious part of the Atlantic system was the Middle Passage, the journey that slaves took or captured Africans took from Africa to the new North American colonies. During this journey, captured Africans were packed into boats, chained up, and given horrible conditions, where many times they often died on the journey. As the population of African slaves grew in North America, there became a development of a distinct slave culture or African culture in North America. African slaves originated from many different tribes and regions of Africa, but over time their differences combined together into something unique. Some common New World African cultural practices included singing, dancing, storytelling, in small and large family units, and also the beginning of shared religious practices. African slaves also resisted working as slaves and did so in passive and more violent ways. Some passive examples of African resistance would be showing ignorance in how to do a certain task, faking illness, faking injury, intentionally working slow, or just running away. However, along with these passive resistances, there are also more violent attempts at resistance. The most famous was the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739, where slaves and some free blacks in South Carolina revolted, killed several landowners, and attempted to make the journey to freedom into Spanish Florida and escape the colonies. Ultimately, they were captured and defeated and then executed. But this brought great fear to the southern planters, and as a result, they began passing slave laws. These laws were meant to limit the rights of slaves and make it harder for them to revolt and gain power. Some examples of the slave laws listed below, they're right here, but the slave laws varied from state to state or from colony to colony.